First of all, by technical definition, I know the video title is a complete contradiction. JRPGs obviously stand for Japanese role-playing games, so for a game to be a JRPG, technically speaking, it should be from Japan. With that said, however, when looking at them from the perspective of a style of gameplay, JRPGs have basically gone on to become a genre of their own over the years. While there's certainly some similarities to Western RPGs, such as level-based progression, JRPGs often opt for a more linear-based approach and place you in the role of a pre-established character within a universe, as opposed to creating your own, which is usually the case for Western RPGs. Look, I could spend a whole video discussing the nuances on this topic and probably trigger a lot of people in the process, but for the sake of time, if you've been playing RPGs long enough, it's pretty easy to look at a game and be like, oh yeah, that's a JRPG. It's why many would argue that games like Dragon's Dogma and Dark Souls, despite being made in Japan, have more in common with Western RPGs, in that games like Undertale and Cosmic Star Heroine play more similarly to JRPGs even though they are made in the West. So yeah, with all that clarification aside, we wanted to highlight some solid titles that were developed in other countries but obviously heavily inspired by the JRPG genre. Now without further ado, here's a list of 8 great JRPGs that weren't actually made in Japan. The first game we have on our list is Septerra Core, Legacy of the Creator. Septerra Core was developed by the North American company Valkyrie Studios and is, oddly enough, the only game they ever created. Now, I know that doesn't inspire the most confidence initially, but I really do think Septerra Core is a hidden gem that gets overlooked these days, and despite being rough around the edges in some parts, it really does have some unique and quality features that make it stand out in some way. At the time of its release, it only came out for the PC, yet it had far more in common with console RPGs such as Final Fantasy, as opposed to pretty much all other PC RPGs. I remember browsing the Target game section when I was like 10 years old, and this one in particular catching my eye just because the cover art style was unlike anything I had seen on PC at the time, and more resembled that of PS1 RPGs and such. Well, in this case, I was right to judge a book by its cover, as despite having more PC-type graphics obviously, it played out exactly like a traditional console JRPG. There's a turn-based battle system with ATB mechanics, party members that join up with you throughout your long journey, and a really engaging steampunk sci-fi fantasy world to explore. For real, the world in Septerra Core is super unique and one of the cooler ones I've seen in an RPG, actually. With that said, despite its creativity, it's not perfect and is a game you need some patience for. If the setting intrigues you though, or if you have a soft spot for the charm of 90s era PC-styled graphics, then Septerra Core definitely oozes that in spades and has enough quality features that make it worth a playthrough. Alright, the next game we have up is Crimson Gem Saga. Crimson Gem Saga was developed by the South Korean studio Ironos and was initially released in North America back in 2009 for the PSP. It's a really fun turn-based RPG that I wouldn't say necessarily reinvents the wheel or anything, it just executes everything that it does do really well. The sprite work and animations look great, the graphics themselves are really charming and vibrant, and not only is the dialogue very well written, but the voice acting is quite excellent as well.
Oh, Mr. Knight! These thugs are trying to hurt me!
Even the menus and the UI in general are just handled very well and streamlined to a satisfying degree. What it lacks in innovation, which first of all isn't even a bad thing, it more than makes up for it with its polish. Being inspired by old school RPGs, however, it can be quite grindy at times, so that is something to consider if you're not really a fan of that. But then again, why are you even playing RPGs if you're not a fan of grinding? At the very least, there are visible enemies instead of random encounters, so you get the option to grind at your own leisure. And like I mentioned earlier, the battle system is a lot of fun, so there are certainly worse games to grind in. The group attacks also give me Chrono Trigger vibes, which are always welcome. So yeah, if I haven't made it obvious enough by now, Crimson Gem Saga is a really solid title that's well worth your time. Check it out if you haven't already. The next game we have on our list is Shyness: The Lightning Kingdom. Shyness was developed by the French studio Inagami and was released back in 2017. It's a really unique game that combines elements of JRPGs, 3D fighters, and 3D platformers. As you can see by the footage, the game sort of has that look and feel of old N64 and PS2 action platformers, such as Ratchet & Clank and Jak and Daxter. Now, it definitely doesn't play that similarly to those titles, as the platforming elements are pretty light. I just thought aesthetically there were some similarities there. There's also some minor puzzle-solving elements as well, making use of each of your party members' unique field abilities in a variety of scenarios. I really love the exploration and shyness, as the bright and charming environments are always a joy to travel around in. Battles are triggered by running into visible enemies on the map, whereas previously mentioned, the game then transitions into a 3D fighter of sorts and places you in a closed-off arena in one-on-one combat. To be completely honest though, while it was pretty fun at first, it did get a little repetitive after a while, as it would have been nice to fight with more than one character at once and fight against more than one enemy at once, instead of the tag team style of format that the game opts for instead. And this kind of brings me to my biggest problem with the game in general. It's very ambitious and has a lot of charm for sure, it just lacks a lot of polish in some aspects. It's actually the complete opposite case compared to the previous game on this list, Crimson Gem Saga, with the innovation of polish ratio. Considering it was developed by an indie studio, I can cut it a little slack as there are some really great ideas here. I don't mean to paint it all bad either, as it's certainly not unplayable by any means and is a pretty fun romp to go through. If the game looks appealing enough to you by the clips, you'll probably enjoy it for what it is and have a good time. Just don't go in expecting AAA levels of quality and polish. At the end of the day though, I wouldn't include it on this list if I didn't think there were some noteworthy aspects that were worth checking out. Plus it has Furry Piccolo. He's pretty dope. The next game we have on our list is Child of Light. Child of Light was developed by the Canadian developer Ubisoft Montreal and was initially released back in 2014. It's an extremely beautiful and artistically impressive turn-based RPG with Metroidvania exploration style of elements. The game looks like it popped right out of a storybook itself, with its watercolored graphics and poetic rhyming nature to all of the text. Exploration is really encouraged in Child of Light, as there's a lot of treasures to find and gorgeous environments to see. As previously mentioned, battles take place in a turn-based format after running into enemies on the map. Battles are a lot of fun and have some extra strategy incorporated with the casting mechanic. When performing a special skill or magic, there's a certain amount of preparation time needed in order to cast it that you or the enemy can cancel by attacking before the gauge is filled. It reminds me of the Grandia series a lot actually, which is a huge plus in my book, as the first two games are some of my favorite RPGs ever. Overall, the artistically stunning graphics, the wonderful music, and the poetic, fairy tale type nature to the game make for a really engaging and immersive playthrough. If you haven't played this one yet, it can be beaten in about 10 to 15 hours, so I highly recommend it. Coming up next, we have Gujian 3. I'm not 100% sure if I pronounced that correctly, but hopefully it's close enough. Gujian 3 was developed by the Chinese studio Oregon Info and Tech. As you can see, it's a stunningly gorgeous game and is easily one of the higher quality games to come from the country. This is definitely no indie studio budget we're talking here. I absolutely love how bright and vibrant some of the environments are, along with all the beautiful oriental music. It creates a really relaxing and immersive atmosphere. Gameplay-wise, Gujian 3 plays out pretty similarly to some of the newer Final Fantasy titles and is like an open-world action RPG of sorts. Combat can be a little hack and slashy at times, but it's fast and fluid and fun to play and has a good level of polish to it. I should note, however, the game only has English subtitles, as it's fully voiced in Chinese, and the translation of the English subtitles at that can be a little less than stellar at times.
从今天开始，没有队伍在外巡视的时候。
It's not that bad though, and is more than good enough to keep you engaged in the game's compelling story. If you're looking for a fun, high-budget action RPG to quench that thirst until Tales of Arise comes out later this year, then Gujian 3 is an awesome game to check out and might just be a sleeper hit for you. At the very least, it's an extremely beautiful world to get lost in. The next game we have up is Secret of Evermore. Secret of Evermore is a really unique game in that it was developed by Squaresoft. However, it was actually the American branch of Squaresoft, which was the only game they ever made. Oddly enough, while this game was originally planned to come out for Japan, it never ended up coming through, so this makes this the only Squaresoft game that never actually came out in Japan. Just a little fun fact of the day for those that didn't know.
Would you like to know more?
Anyway, Both aesthetically and gameplay-wise, the game looks and feels really similar to another Squaresoft title, Secret of Mana, which that one was obviously developed by a Japanese team. I mean, come on. Secret of Mana, Secret of Evermore. It's in the name, they didn't even try to hide it. I wouldn't say it's quite on the same level, but it's still a really fun experience, and the whole time traveling gimmick gives you a variety of cool environments and time eras to explore in. With that said, the menus can be sort of confusing to navigate, and the hitboxes can be a little wonky at times, so you do need some of that retro game tolerance. If you're a fan of old school RPGs or cool sprite work, then this is one to check out if you haven't already. Unfortunately, it did ever only come out for the Super Nintendo, which makes it a little harder to play these days. Legally, at least. But who knows, we've gotten a lot of Mana remakes and ports recently, so maybe they can add Secret of Evermore to that list as well. Come on, Square, we're all waiting. Alright, coming up next, we have both Magna Carta, Tears of Blood, and Magna Carta 2. Both the games in this series were developed by the South Korean studio Softmax. To be completely honest, I only played the second game though, so I'm only going to talk about that one. While the first game was released for the PS2, the second game came out for the Xbox 360, which I found a little strange considering it's not normally a popular JRPG console. Or KRPG. Or whatever you want to call it in this case. Anyway, Magna Carta 2 is a pretty fun action RPG that takes place in an aesthetically pleasing, vibrant fantasy world. That, along with the music, are probably the main reasons you would want to play this game, as the story and characters themselves aren't necessarily the best the genre has to offer. It's a little generic in that regard, and the way a lot of dialogue and cutscenes play out is pretty cheaply made and lacks some immersion, but if you can get past that, there's an enjoyable world to see here and some fun to be had. For a game that came out in 2009, it still looks and sounds great. Especially sounds. Despite the story and characters being pretty average, the characters themselves are voiced by an absolutely top-notch cast filled with various powerhouses in the anime industry. I mean, we have Johnny Young Bosch as the main character, along with the help of Crispin Freeman, Laura Bailey, and Yuri Lowenthal, just to name a few. If this all looks appealing to you and you're a sucker for pretty worlds and great voice acting, then check this one out. Alright, to finish off this list, we have Sudeki. Sudeki was made by British developer Climax Studios and was released for the Xbox back in 2004. It's a pretty obscure game that many of you might not have heard of, as it's the only Japanese-inspired RPG on the original Xbox. I remember that fact alone really got my attention as a kid and kept me following the game for years until it eventually came out. So, was it worth the wait and did it live up to my hype as a kid? Sorta. While not a bad game by any means, as I wouldn't include it on this list if that was the case, it just probably won't blow you away. Just being honest. The story itself has a cool concept, but the characters on the other hand are pretty much walking stereotypes. Thankfully, they're fun to play as though. There are 4 playable characters, 2 of which play from a third-person action perspective, and the other 2 play from a first-person shooter perspective. That variety in party member gameplay is actually really unique. I also like how they implemented the weapon and skill upgrade system. It's simple and not too complex, just how I like it. Probably my favorite thing about Sudeki, however, is just how beautiful the world looks, especially for an original Xbox game. For the most part, the environments are just so bright and vivid. They do a great job in encouraging me to explore more. Overall, Sudeki may not be an absolute masterpiece, but it is a very interesting RPG from England that has some notable aspects to it that can be worth going back to and checking out these days. If you're into them, that is. Okay, and that wraps up this list over 8 great JRPGs that weren't actually made in Japan. If you enjoyed the video, it would mean a lot if you could either hit that like button, leave a comment, or even consider subscribing. We put out JRPG content every week. Also, if you're interested in seeing a part 2 to this, let us know. There were some other games I wanted to include here, but just ran out of room with our whole 8 great format. Honestly, I could have just made this whole list with American indie games alone, but I wanted to spread the love around the world a bit. So yeah, as always, links to our Patreon and social media can be found in our bio below for those wishing to further support the channel. Other than that, have an awesome day everyone. This is Gaming Productions. Until next time.